EGROW Friday webinar series. I must share this good news with you that we have done about 270 webinars like this so far. We've been very fortunate. 5 Nobel laureates have come and spoken to us. Even last week we had a Nobel laureate speaking to us. And we have had a fair good blend of foreigners and Indians coming and speaking on this EGROW webinar series. We have discussed contemporary issues, not only relevant for India, but for the global economy. We have discussed national security issues, socio-economic issues like poverty and unemployment, and of course, we have also discussed lots of books on diplomatic issues. Actually, Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin has been here with us earlier also because he's a solid researcher and he publishes quite regularly. Our aim and objective of this series was basically bringing the best minds across the world to talk about issues that are relevant for India and also issues that we in India have some command are relevant for the rest of the world. So this think tank serves as a post office of ideas for the rest of the world and India and for India and the rest of the world. So we believe in disseminating knowledge as well as absorbing knowledge if it is anywhere there in the world which is relevant for us. I'll just flag two major issues before I move on. Under the G20 presidency, and you know that Ambassador Shringla would agree with me, that was a very important event. EGROW did 21 webinars, 10 of them under the new international economic order. Then we did 6 on climate, and then we did 5 on women empowerment. The other thing, which I think EGROW is the first one to talk about, is that within the country, which is a continent-sized country, we have so much to learn from each other. Rather for everything going to Germany or France or Australia, why not look within? There is so much to learn from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, Gujarat, Maharashtra within our own country. And many states in our own country which were doing very well, for example, Punjab, have been not doing so well in recent years. So much to learn from them also as to what is that is causing them that decline. Haryana, the neighboring state of Punjab, is doing exceedingly well. So the very purpose of this webinar series is to learn from each other. Coming to major issues that would happen once we have I would say, a paradigm shift in international trade. And I'm referring to the tariff wars, which was becoming almost imminent by last November. We all knew what had happened in the Trump 1 era. And obviously, many of us were prepared in the Trump 2 era. And here comes a book at that point of time, which Avtar Singh Bhasin wrote on the India's trade agreements, in negotiating those trade agreements. So we requested him if he could come and share his book, the findings with us. I had the good luck of listening to his book presentation, and of course, then I bought one when when there was a book, I think, book launch at IIC. We then requested Ambassador Shringla if he could chair the session, and he kindly agreed to. And then, of course, Suhasini Haidar, she is the diplomatic editor of the Hindu, and we thought if she can come and also share her thoughts. And luckily, we were able to put the three of them together, and here we are today. And I think this book, the ideas in this book, are becoming extremely relevant for not only our country, but for the world, even the new international economic order that we are facing. Let me introduce first the speaker for the day, and then I'll introduce the chair, and then the discussant before I hand over the session to Ambassador Shringla. Our main speaker for the day is Avtar Singh Bhasin, already been with us earlier. He retired from the Ministry of External Affairs in 93 as Director Historical Division after 3 decades of service. Since retirement, he has taken to academic research, which is a prolific writer. He was Senior Fellow of the Indian Council of Historical Research and then Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Contemporary Studies, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. His area of research has been India's relations with neighboring countries. He has over the years compiled documents on India's relation with Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. He published an annual series, India's Foreign Relations, for the Ministry of External Affairs from 2002 to 2013. He has been also contributing articles on South Asian affairs in newspapers and journals. To chair the session today, we have Ambassador Shringla, who retired from the Indian Foreign Service as Chief Coordinator for India's G20 presidency in 2023. He has previously served as Foreign Secretary of India and India's Ambassador to the United States, High Commissioner to Bangladesh, and Ambassador to Thailand. He joined IFS in 84. He held a variety of positions both in Delhi at the headquarters and abroad at Indian diplomatic missions. He was posted in France, the permanent mission of India to the United Nations in New York, Vietnam, Israel, and South Africa. Our discussant for the day is Suhasini Haidar. She is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected national dailies, regularly writing on foreign policy issues. Prior to this, she was Foreign Affairs editor and primetime anchor for India's leading 24-hour English news channel CNN-IBN, where she presented the signature show Worldview with Suhasini Haidar, and correspondent for CNN International's New Delhi Bureau before that. In 2015, she was the recipient of the most prestigious Indian print journalism Prem Bhatia Award and has won a series of awards for her work in television as well. In India, she has covered the foreign affairs beat for over a decade, and her domestic assignments include critical profiles, in-depth reportage from conflict zones, including Kashmir, where she was injured in a bomb blast in 2000. With this, I would now like to hand over the session to Ambassador Shringla to take the proceedings further. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Charan Singh ji, both for your introductory remarks and for hosting this very timely session. And I'll, of course, come to why I feel it is timely. I want to also welcome all those who have logged in to be a part of this session to discuss Dr. Avtar Singh Bhasin's latest book, Negotiating India's Landmark Agreements. I think you'll all agree that this is a landmark publication on India's landmark agreements. And certainly, I think from my perspective, it offers absolutely wonderful, refreshing and contemporary insight into what I believe are the most seminal agreements that India has signed with our partners across the world. I also want to welcome Suhasini, Dr. Suhasini Haidar, who's diplomatic editor with Hindu. I've also known Suhasini for ever since I think I've joined service, and I know that she will add great value to the discussions. So let me come down to the subject at hand. And first of all, Dr. Bhasin, I think by way of full disclosure, I am a great admirer of your work. We have known each other since I was Joint Secretary BSM, I think, dealing with our neighborhood, and your, I think, interest in subjects that I was dealing with, I think, brought us into close proximity and contact. And I think since then, of course, we have been in regular touch. But I think your own work takes us back to the time when the Ministry of External Affairs had a historical division, and this division was, for those of us who may or may not know, it's a legendary division which was manned by legendary personalities like Dr. Bhasin himself. And it makes one, feel even today. I mean, in a certain sense, it makes one question why the division was wound up as it did. I think around the time that I joined service, because even today, despite digitization, despite the fact that you can put all your agreements, on a digital format and access it easily, I think the MEA does need a central repository of all agreements that are signed by the government of India with our foreign interlocutors, and a division that can assess, analyze, and provide inputs on these agreements, on the way that you are doing, Dr. Bhasin, with the books that you have produced, but in a more, obviously, in a more customized and an exclusive manner within the ministry. So there is, I think, still a case to have a historic division, although I doubt that we will get the sort of stalwarts that we had at that time, people who were erudite, learned, knowledgeable, but most important, pursued their research and took such a great interest in their work that I think one of the things I admired about Dr. Bhasin was the fact that he was dogged. I mean, he continued to work harder than any, regular employee of the government on his passion, which is basically, providing research, collating information based on, unclassified documents or, recently unclassified documents, official records, and essentially putting them together and providing the analysis that you have in the way of this book. And incidentally, I think one of the things I also admire is that not only does it involve an assimilation of a great amount of research, but I think the unique thing about this book is that it is very, very, easy reading. It is very, very interesting reading. It can be picked up by anybody, from someone who's in high school or someone who is a researcher or an academic. So it is certainly a book that I think provides you with information, provides you with data that you may not have ever seen, but it also provides analysis that is, in many senses, not only unique, but has shed new light into India's contemporary history. So certainly, I mean, all of the books that you've written in the past on our neighbors, on the partition period, on Sri Lanka, on India-Bangladesh relations, all of them, in a certain sense, find their way, in some senses, into the 5 agreements that have been a part of this book. I think a lot of India's foreign policy today emanates from this. And it really makes one feel that when you negotiate agreements of this nature, it is very important to get it right, because if you don't get it right, then there are all sorts of implications that they have on your foreign policy, on your national security, on your ability to maintain your influence in your region and beyond. And I think there are successful examples, and ultimately it is only posterity that can tell you how successful or how useful many of these, or some or many of these agreements have been for us. It is certainly not clear to those who actually negotiate and conclude these agreements, but it is left to those who assess it many years later, as we are doing, to see what these agreements have been all about. So, as all of us know, a part of the discussion, that there are 5 major landmark agreements that have been listed in this book, beginning with the India-China Agreement on Tibet in 1954. And here, I think, of course, this is a relevant agreement even today, because we are dealing with the fallout of this agreement. Whether you talk about, the incidents the latest incidents in 2020 at Galwan, or before that on the India, Bhutan, China trilateral tri-junction area, or earlier, right down to 1962, the conflict and skirmish at that time. And I think, clearly the book brings out various facets of the personalities behind these negotiations, the way it was done, the strategic implications, the pulls and pressures. But what is important, I think, is that we were still in an area of, looking at foreign policy from an idealistic lens, as opposed to, more pragmatic lens of realpolitik, perhaps of the sort of realpolitik that you see today. And this idealism, I think, did not allow us to take into account the fact that our interlocutors may not be as honorable or as idealistic as we had been at that time. And had we covered our bases, as they say, successfully at that time, had in India's recognition of the sovereignty of or China's sovereignty over Tibet, had we secured our long-term interests through guarantees on the border, I think we might not have had many of these incidents from 1962 to today's situation with China. It was very clear all along that the Chinese were looking for a certain agreement that discounted anything that came from the past. I think at that time we were in a fairly strong position because there were a number of agreements or at least areas which involved Tibet in the past, and where the Chinese were obliged to take these into account, but they simply, I think, overrode our considerations and went ahead and got us to sign an agreement that recognized Tibet, and that status quo holds good even today, but without any sense of what the border between India and China should really be. And we, of course, were focused on the McMahon line, when, of course, there was also the middle sector, as we call it, Uttarakhand, Himachal, etc., but also the western sector, the Ladakh sector, where we have so many problems in today's context. The other, of course, is the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation, 1971. All of us, many of us, I would not say all, many of us will remember this treaty as being one of the most, I would say, not just important, but one that really, came up over all the others, because the circumstances under which this was signed, this was when we had a situation where the United States was being very supportive of China's growth and development to the exclusion of others. And at the same time, Pakistan was extremely active both in the Western and Eastern Front, and we needed certain guarantees. And I think the case that is made out in this book, of course, was that the treaty was really motivated by the Soviets' desire to get us into some sort of a military alliance vis-a-vis China, which we were reluctant to get into, understandably. And it therefore did not go further. I mean, that's where it really ended. And that is absolutely correct. One part of that agreement, I think, which served its purpose very admirably, was the fact that during the 1971 campaign, especially in East Pakistan, present-day Bangladesh, I think the treaty did serve as a deterrent to both US and Chinese, propensity to intervene one way or the other, and it might have been at least a psychological deterrent. But this is something we are happy to hear from both Dr. Avtar Singh and Suhasini as we go along. The Shringla Agreement of 1971. Now, this is very relevant today because Pakistan has just decided to suspend the Shringla Agreement, and I'll come down to this as I conclude my opening remarks. But here again, the point that has been made is that Mrs. Gandhi, took a statesman-like view, and her thinking was that if we imposed an unfair treaty or we imposed conditions that would be humiliating for Pakistan, it would result in another Versailles-like situation. It was better to work on friendship with Pakistan and get them to work with us on a long-term basis. But again, we have dishonorable neighbors, and I think the moment the treaty was signed, everything was forgotten, and Pakistan went back to its earlier ways. I just had an interview with BBC where I said that Pakistan has never abided by the treaty. The moment it was signed, they've gone to the United Nations, they've gone to other countries to intervene on Jammu and Kashmir. They have fostered and supported, sponsored and supported cross-border terrorism, and have been adventurous, whether it's in in the context of Siachen, or whether it's in the context of many other efforts, Kargil, etc., in which they've tried to take territory from India. But I'd like to know from Dr. Avtar Singh, as we get an opportunity to listen to him, as to what would be the implications of suspension, the unilateral suspension of the Simla Agreement. What does it mean? What are the? I mean, I've also looked at it, but I'm very much keen on your view. The India-Sri Lanka Accord of 1987, which I think worked out badly for us. We inserted ourselves into an ethnic conflict in our neighborhood without fully understanding the consequences of doing that. And I think we came out dishonorably out of this whole thing. And I think that influenced the way the region perceived us also for many years after that. And finally, the India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2008. This is a great, I would say, masterstroke, which enabled us to come out of our nuclear isolation and also enabled the US to look at us now as a bulwark against China, ironically. Earlier, a bulwark, the Soviet Union, the China was a bulwark against the Soviet Union. We're a bulwark against China. And ultimately, I think the effort is possibly to draw a wedge between Russia and China also in the current context. So, great power politics will continue to have its way. But today, we are not a country that can be pushed around. I think we are definitely on that decision-making table, and our weight will count in any such decisions that would be taken by some of the big players. We may not be the big player, but we will be participants in any discussion that would involve a sort of geopolitical future of countries and regions. So essentially, I just want to conclude by again, really commenting on, the sort of academic rigor that has gone into the book, the sort of clarity that this has brought in our appraisal of treaties that have been so important to our country, in subsequent years and decades after that. The sort of conflict of interest between idealism and pragmatism, regional sort of regional influence versus global leadership. There are a lot of issues that are here, which are very, very important. And I think the fact that it takes into account geopolitical and historical backgrounds, takes into account who are the key players and negotiators in each case. I think that is very, very important. What are the personalities behind each agreement? What motivated them? What were the factors that led to their thinking? And where were the shortcomings and where were the achievements that crowned some of these agreements? Drafting and negotiating challenges, of course, domestic political pressures that are always part of this calculus, and the strategic aspects of this on a geopolitical plane. There's lots more we can say because the subject is fascinating, and we can go on. But I'll stop here and request Dr. A.S. Bhasin to really give us his, first-hand views on this absolutely seminal work, and I would say really one of the best works in recent times on contemporary Indian foreign policy issue. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Bhasin.
Thank you very much, sir, for your very kind words. Probably, I don't know if I deserve all that what you said. Nevertheless, you have said them, and I accept them with all humility. Why did I choose these 5 agreements? That is important. Because after all, India had signed so many of them. While looking at these agreements and selecting these 5, I selected those which had left a long-term impact on our relation with those countries generally. Whether it was good or bad is a different thing altogether. But they have been important in their own way. And to make a structural sort of presentation, I have written down my remarks. With your permission, I will go through. First of all, I would like to thank EGROW Foundation and its CEO, Shri Charan Singh, for organizing this discussion on my book, Negotiating India's Landmark Agreements. I take it as an honor, like Shri Shringla, former Foreign Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs, where I served for 3 decades chairing the discussion, and Mrs. Suhasini Haidar, who, as a journalist, brings scholarly value to her profession, representing one of the oldest newspapers of India, the Hindu, is the Discussant. I welcome all those who have tied up with us through this innovative link. On independence, India found the world different from the one when it lost it. In the last almost 200 years of India's history, its interest was subordinated to that of its sovereign, who lived thousands of miles away. India, of course, did inherit the legacy of the Raj, but it had to be tempered with Indian ethos and old values. New India, the self-governing India, demanded a more nuanced and sophisticated diplomacy with a new lexicon suited to the needs of the new world in which it was thrown in. After 1947, India signed several agreements with various countries on a variety of subjects, some to promote friendship, some to strengthen it, and still some even esoteric subjects. More than anything, the peace between neighbors is paramount, and it hangs on the well-negotiated agreed borders, which only come into being as a result of adjustment of rival claims, interests, and ambitions at point where they join. My book, as the title suggests, is made of several agreements, 5 to be specific. I chose these 5 since in my opinion, they left a long-term impact, benign or baleful, on India's relation with those countries or even generally. The first agreement of any significance was India signed after independence was with People's Republic of China and Tibet, where India had inherited certain facilities and advantages which the Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had termed imperialist inheritance. These advantages accrued to India when China was unable to enforce its right in Tibet. After the communist revolution, New China's first task was to reassert itself in Tibet and occupy it. Once that happened, India's position became somewhat incongruous with Tibet's new status, and China decided to squeeze India out. India saw the writing on the wall, proposed talks in the hope that under the negotiated settlement, the new institution would breathe easy. Unfortunately, in renegotiating facilities, India deliberately chose not to discuss its border with Tibet, which had become India's boundary with China and had remained unsettled in all these years. It was defiance of the dictum already referred to that agreed borders between neighbors are a guarantee of peace. In the east, there was a 1914 McMahon line which no Chinese government had ever recognized and regarded it humiliating. The western boundary was marked on the Survey of India maps inherited from the British as undefined. McMahon line was ironical in many ways. Not only China never recognized it, the area which Tibet had ceded at Shimla was in 1947 still under Tibetan occupation, and it was not until April 1951 that India occupied it and called it Nifa, the present state of Arunachal Pradesh. In any case, the PRC in Article 55 of its Common Minimum Program, which then served its constitution, has laid down that it shall examine the treaties and agreements between Kuomintang and foreign governments and shall recognize, abrogate, revise, or renegotiate them according to respective contents. It may also be relevant to point out that in a couple of months after the independence, in October 1947, Tibet had, in a letter to the Prime Minister, demanded return of Tibetan territories which in the past had been gradually incorporated in India. The territory asked for return included Sikkim, Bhutan, Darjeeling, Ladakh, and many more. In going for negotiation for a settlement of the Indian position in Tibet, China gave no space to India. It made China accept all that it desired and India tamely surrendered. The China remained insensitive to India's concern, loosely ignored. It had turned down India's request for use of two passes, Rawang and Udok, which directly linked Tibet with Ladakh for trade and pilgrimage. China would not agree and even threatened a deadlock if India insisted, and there would be no agreement at all. China's reason for this stand was that Ladakh, as part of J&K state, was a disputed territory between India and Pakistan, and it did not want to get involved in India-Pakistan dispute. India, despite making it a question of territorial integrity, tamely surrendered before the Chinese assertion. The discussion, which should not have taken more than a few days to conclude, took 4 long months, during which, even if the Indian negotiators were not tired, they did get exasperated. At the end, after surrendering everything, India was left wondering at the wisdom of bending to the dictates of China in search of Asian solidarity, which too remained illusionary. The very idea of an agreement was to work out arrangements which would allow the Indian institution in Tibet to function smoothly. Even this was not achieved, since their working after the agreement became almost impossible, and finally they were closed. They were shut. This description as a Panchil agreement, together with Hindi Bible syndrome, led to sinister consequences. India's decision not to discuss and settle the boundary proved most unfortunate, which cost rather dearly. India's present problem with China began right there. Well, that is what I have to say about the India-China agreement. Now let us move to Indo-Soviet Treaty, which the treaty which India signed with Soviet Union in August 1971 was in fact the revived proposal of a treaty lying dormant since 1969, when Moscow at first suo motu proposed it. At that time, it was put on the back burner since it was feared it would breach India's non-aligned policy. But 71 was a different time. There was a fear of China joining Pakistan in the imminent conflict in East Pakistan. Even then, India, while signing the treaty, felt quite uncomfortable. And EAM Swaran Singh had spent 2 days in Moscow in June trying to prevail on Moscow that it would suffice if it issued a simple statement which would keep China out. Since Soviets insisted on TT, India had no alternative but to sign it. The war with Pakistan was won, and while China had stayed out. Why Moscow was keen on a treaty became clear soon after the Bangladesh War. After the war in February 1972, D.P. Dhar, former ambassador in Moscow, now chairman of the Policy Planning Committee in the MEA, accompanied by General Manisha, visited Moscow with list of arms and equipment needed to replenish the war losses in which Soviets were expected to help. Moscow now was not Moscow of the previous year. It now did promise all that we needed and more if India signed a new military alliance specifically against China. India reminded Moscow that the treaty signed only a few months ago and valid for next 20 years would suffice in any future eventuality and therefore a fresh treaty was not necessary. Moscow did not take India's reluctance kindly, and both Ambassador Dhar and Manekshaw had to return home empty-handed, holding unmet lists. Moscow, in signing the 71 agreement, had calculated if India could breach the non-aligned fort of India once, it would be easy to prevail on New Delhi for a little more lethal treaty. This was its disappointment. From here, we move to Simla Agreement, which was the outcome of the war with Pakistan and Bangladesh. It was a unique agreement in that the defeated country, Pakistan, set the tone of negotiations. Pakistan's problem was twofold: normalizing relations with India and release of 93,000 prisoners who had surrendered to the giant command of India and Bangladesh. Pakistan wanted to de-link the two issues, but India had made it clear to Pakistan that question of the release of prisoners cannot be decided by India alone, and Pakistan has to recognize Bangladesh for any progress in this matter. India was cognizant the United States was busy rescuing Pakistan to escape the adverse consequences of the war, particularly for recent help in facilitating Henry Kissinger's clandestine visit to Beijing. Some of the other Western countries, particularly France, Germany, Denmark, and United Kingdom, were equally active in doing so. Their envoys stationed in Dhaka had together met Indian and Soviet ambassadors separately and cautioned that trial of prisoners or their commanders would take a serious turn, and any possibility of understanding with President Bhutto would be ruled out. Surprisingly, India at the very outset had suo motu given a letter to the UN Security Council and to Pakistan that India was prepared to talk with Pakistan at any time, at any level, and without any preconditions. It was a novel experiment in diplomacy that the victorious power was ensuring a defeated country that it would negotiate without preconditions. India's position to negotiate had also been compromised by Moscow when DP Dhar was asked and assurance was sought that India will do nothing to alter the present territorial status quo on the ceasefire line by force or any other means. In other words, Pakistan would not be asked to vacate POK, and if there was a settlement, it would be on the ceasefire line. Similarly, France and some other countries had advised New Delhi that Kashmir was kept out of negotiation. Pakistan too had cautioned India that a dispute which could not be settled in the last 25 years would not be settled in the 5 days of negotiations. Pakistan remaining proactive just before the negotiations began in Shimla had sent a message through Moscow that Pakistan would not agree to any settlement which would be dictated by India, and that it should be honorable, honest, and just one for both the countries. Otherwise, there will be no agreement and no settlement. Since Moscow had carried the message, it underlined their endorsement of it, and India could not afford to ignore it. During the talks with the Bhutto had insisted on maintenance of status quo on Kashmir, hoping for a settlement to evolve in due course. Apparently, this was also the understanding that finally emerged when Bhutto and Mrs. Gandhi met on the night of July 2, after talks had failed. Later, Pakistan reneged since there was no written understanding. India had not kept an archival record of that conversation, and whole exercise proved futile. Bhutto undoubtedly proved himself a clever negotiator, starting from a position of greatest possible disadvantage and weakness. He finally succeeded in extricating his 93,000 prisoners while warning of a solution on Kashmir and even recovered the lost territory in the western sector without considering anything of substance to India. India could only India could only take solace in the fact that India had split Pakistan into two. What happened in Bangladesh since then, to India's disappointment, is another long story. Now I come to India-Sri Lanka Accord. It was a highly noxious phase of our foreign policy when caution was thrown to the winds. Our small neighbor, Sri Lanka, had an inherent problem between its two linguistic communities, 74% Sinhalese and 12% Tamils. Paradoxically, the real culprit was democracy, which is based on majoritarianism. Tamil feared that the democratic constitution would set up an immutable communal oligarchy in perpetual power. Tamil's inability to find an equilibrium both linguistically and culturally with the Sinhalese created a combustible situation in which India imprudently got involved, first on the side of Tamils and then on the side of Colombo. No due diligence was done of Tamil demands, whether they were reasonable or not. The Tamils were being supercilious in insisting that a language of 12% should also be national language, like that of 74% Sinhalese. Their other demand of a homeland by merger of two Tamil provinces, north and east, was repugnant to the very concept of a nation state, and Sri Lanka at no time was willing to concede. At no time India assessed Tamil's willingness to adjust their demands. On the contrary, with India's backing, they became more intransigent and hopeful that India would get them their homeland and Elam, as in the case of Bangladesh. While the militants among them took to arms and waged a battle with Sri Lanka, the moderates rejected any compromise solution worked out by New Delhi with Colombo. India unfortunately failed to rebuke them on their obstinacy and uncompromising attitude. Indian policy suffered from contradiction, but initially it was feared that Elam would have profound implications and could lead to a pan-Tamil movement in South. On the other hand, it was feared in high official circles that if Tamils were not helped, it might lead to Tamil Nadu's alienation. Colombo itself felt helpless in the face of Indian support for the Tamil cause and unable to tackle the ethnic problem, decided to involve India on its side, agreeing to its other security concerns. Agreeing to disarm the Tamils militant group, LTTE, even if it involved the use of Indian army, was an exercise in expediency and short of prudence. The upshot was signing of the India-Sri Lanka Accord, July 1987, committing Indian army to disarming Tamil militants who were a determined lot. The agreement was signed when both the moderate and the militant Tamils had rejected it out of hand. At the end, whole exercise turned out to be war between the Indian militant Tamils and Indian army, in which army lost 55 officers, 1100 other ranks, and wounded numbered 2,854. It is rather late, and India learned rather late, and at a very high cost, that getting involved in the domestic affairs of a small neighbor, that too militarily, was a policy inherently flawed and cost India both prestige and national honor. India is so geographically placed that it is surrounded by small neighbors who are not contiguous with each other and must interact through India. This has been an annoying and exasperating fact of their geography. India at times, by dominating attitude, drove them to adopt policies which cut at its own interest by the coding to outside powers. And finally, India-US Civil Nuclear Energy Agreement, which is very, very complementary to the negotiators who negotiated this agreement on behalf of India. In signing the civil nuclear agreement, it was United States, a superpower which reversed its own policy it had doggedly pursued for more than a quarter of a century to punish India for conducting a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974 and also for audacity in not signing a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, since India had found it discriminatory. As a result of that, the US adopted legislation which sought to contain and restrain India's ambition to develop nuclear technology. India's scientific community, as also the bureaucracy, were alienated with Washington since it had even stopped nuclear fuel for the Tarapur nuclear plant and neither it allowed reprocessing of spent fuel. After China's nuclear test in 1964, India felt insecure, fearing nuclear coercion. India, however, continued, continued its research in nuclear science. In 1998, India tested a weaponized nuclear device developed with its own efforts and announced to the world that it unambiguously, irrevocably become a nuclear power by its own effort, though it had to suffer still more sanctions from the United States and others. At the turn of the millennium, India was seen as an emerging global economic power, largely on the creativity of its own people. This was the time when the US started appreciating the overwhelming contribution of Indian diaspora into its economy. A duly impressed President Bush felt it necessary to seek a broad and deep relationship with India as a natural fit for his strategic interest. Washington too was affected by other developments like collapse of the Soviet Union, a rise of China, and the need to bridle it. Pakistan, which until the first term of President Bush treated softly in the second term, was seen as a troubled state riddled with extremism in its mosques, its madrasas, and unfortunately even in its security services. It was also found that the policy of trying to put the Indian nuclear genie back in the bottle had failed. All these factors convinced Washington that sanctions devised to coerce India had outlived the utility and there was a need for a change. Secretary of State Cordelia Rice and other officials looking for a policy alternative that would attract India were convinced that the old policy of nuclear apartheid and nuclear denial regime had to go and given India access to nuclear technologies. Beginning with the modest program, next step in strategic partnership in January 2004 was followed by signing of the Defense Framework Agreement as a necessary response to the changing reality of ever-changing world. The July 2005 visit of Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh to Washington proved a landmark occasion when they decided to work together in a manner that would enable Washington to help India in the development of civil nuclear energy. It set in motion a series of arduous negotiations between the officials of India and the United States to achieve the objective of cooperation. It was a demanding journey for the Indian official, who went through many rounds of negotiations with their American counterparts, matching wit for wit without blinking. There were occasions when the Americans felt exasperated while discussing finer points, but Indian negotiators neither lost their cool nor desisted from making their point. In the process, India had to undergo tedious layers of conditionalities like separation of its nuclear reactors for military and civilian use, file a declaration regarding civil facilities with the International Atomic Energy Agency, obtain waiver from Nuclear Suppliers Group before the United States finally amended Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act 1954. While the negotiations with the United States were successful, the UP government had to face some domestic uncertainty, since the left partners in the coalition government had almost vetoed it. In an ingenious choreography, the government finally outmaneuvered the opposition and signed the agreement which ended India's quarter of a century old nuclear denial regime. The contributions of the United States in achieving the objective of nuclear cooperation was no less onerous. It was for the first time in its constitutional history, at least since 1954, it amended its laws to accommodate India. It was the United States which prevailed upon the naysayers among the NSC members to enter into nuclear trade with India. In the wake of the agreement, while most of the sanctions melted away, whatever restrictions were still left on some entities have recently been removed under the same 2008 agreement. It's important to note that, that while nuclear reactors were central to the public debate, the agreement was for the entire gamut of nuclear and missile technologies, reprocessing of spent fuel, nuclear trade, and much more. The recent permission to an American company, Holtec International, to design and build nuclear reactors in India is significant and is the extension of the same 2008 agreement. The present state of political relations between India and United States would be difficult to achieve without that agreement. So that agreement of 2008 has been a very, very important landmark which gave better relations with United States and technology and all that. I think I have said enough, and with that, I thank everybody for their patience to listen to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Avtar Singh, for a very comprehensive, uh, you know, statement on the book. I think it enhances our clarity in understanding exactly what went into it. Before I go to Suhasini, and I know time is short, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. From what I can see, at least 4 of the 5 agreements, with the exception of the India-US nuclear agreement, could have been differently concluded, if I'm not mistaken. That is the basic surmise, that at least 4 of these agreements could have been different. And I refer especially to 2 agreements. One is the India-China agreement on Tibet, and the other is the Simla Agreement, 1972. In just a very, very briefly, if I could ask you, on the India-China agreement on Tibet, besides the fact that we should have, insisted on the recognition of the India-China boundary when we recognize Tibet, what else could we have, hope for in negotiating that deal in 1957? Can I just quickly ask you that, Dr. Avtar Singh?
You see, if we had discussed the borders and insisting on discussing, at least would have known Chinese position that they are not accepting. And we would have understood China better than we understood otherwise. and this Chini Hindi bye-bye syndrome would not have been there. We would have known the Chinese are no style as long as our concerns are there. So that is my point, that not discussing the borders, we did not know what the Chinese really intentions are. And also, everything we had in Tibet before this agreement was lost. What did we gain out of this? Nothing. So I don't know how another way it could have been. I've been very critical, I know. But I said when I'm writing it, I have to be honest and I should write what I feel. And I felt very strongly that we were giving in on everything. Tell me one item on which we stood and made China agree. Even on the use of two passes. They said, we will, if you insist on doing it, there'll be no agreement. And we gave in and accepted Ladakh and is part of dispute.
And the best
That's
part
my
of it
answer.
is that the agreement was in China's interest. So if there's no agreement, it is to your detriment, not anybody else's detriment, because it was a recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet that the agreement was all about. It's fascinating, and I want to draw you in further on many other aspects, including the Simla agreement. But let us go to Suhasini because the time is short, and if there is an opportunity, we'll come back, Dr. Singh. Suhasini, I just wanted to, I mean, of course, you will give us your comments and you will, speak on the book. But a quick question on the Simla agreement, if you can factor this into your remarks. That, what does, putting the Simla agreement in abeyance mean today? What could be the possible implications of putting this agreement in abeyance? What does it mean for us, for example? So appreciate your views on this and any other aspect that you want to speak on.
As far as Pakistan
you.
threatening to cancel this Shimla agreement, there's nothing to cancel. There's nothing that they can do. All that what is contained in Shimla agreement was to be implemented immediately, like restoration of relations, economic relations, political relations, or withdrawing of forces to the borders. All was to be implemented immediately on the conclusion of the agreement. There has been nothing left after that when these points were concluded. Trade agreement, economic relations were started. Everything happened within a few months of the agreement. And as far as the agreement today is concerned, it is like any other agreement lying dormant, which has served its purpose, immediate purpose, and is there on paper. So it's Pakistan cancelling it or whatever, withdrawing it makes hardly any difference. I think they just wanted to make a point that if you are holding that in abeyance, we will hold this in abeyance.
I would agree for most part. I think that the Simla agreement does not hold water in that great an amount. But Ambassador Shringla, you're absolutely right to ask the question. I think the two lasting legacies, if you like, of the Shimla Accord was to begin with that the ceasefire line would henceforth be called the line of control. Giving it a slightly more permanent nature, but not following through on the promise that Mr. Bhutto gave Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, which has also been recorded in Mr. Bhasin's work, essentially that they would then move towards making it an international boundary. So I think that making it a little more fluid is going to have repercussions on both sides. I mean, India might actually say, then why do we need to even look at the LOC as something more permanent? And of course, the Modi government has in the last 10 years made it clear that the only thing they want to discuss is the part of Kashmir that is on the other side of the LOC. So I think Pakistan might be biting off more than it can chew. It may not have thought through what it plans to do. So one was the ceasefire line. The other part was, of course, not bringing in third-party mediation. I think there's a little bit of double speak on both sides on this, because, of course, Pakistan has frequently gone to the UN. Of course, Pakistan has frequently tried to get others involved. But we have not been as averse to third-party discourse on these issues. But normally we use the third party for conflict management. So even in 2019, as you might remember, there was Mr. Trump who announced the release of the Indian pilot a few hours before it actually happened, and basically took credit for it. There was the UAE leader. There were other leaders in the West Asia who sort of seemed to be making to both countries. So I think in terms of that, yes, the Simla agreement is not so valid anymore. But of course, the idea that all of these are being ripped up reminds us that none of these agreements are set in stone. None of these agreements mean that we are all wedded to them. And as you pointed out, each of the agreements that is in this book has, in a sense, a lot of current value. Sri Lanka, not the 1987 accord, but the one prior to that, the 1972 accord, came up during elections last year, when the government said we want to re-look at how Kachativu was given away. So it reminds us that these never really go away, which is why this book is particularly important to read. The fact that the chapter on China, which Mr. Bhasin has spoken at some length about, but that is as important, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a bit. But it's as important today as we are negotiating a kind of rapprochement with China, negotiating a peace, as it was in these last 5 years of conflict. Because the one thing I think that comes through in Mr. Bhasin's book is that it doesn't hurt India to wait. That India has to learn the art of not wanting a deal. It's not the art of making a deal, but the art of saying, if there is a deal that works for us, maybe we should just walk away from it. The fact is that all relationships that are discussed in this book have seen ups and downs. Some, like Pakistan, have seen downs and further downs. I don't know how many of you, I brought the book with me, so you can see how many places I have flagged over here. Truth is, those of you who are old enough to know about how the Encyclopedia Britannica works, long before Google was there, know that there is a micropedia and a macropedia. So the macropedia is where the entire detail of something is given, whereas the micropedia is where you get small blurbs. And this, I would say, is like the micropedia for me, because from here I then go and sort of refer to the larger agreement, because Mr. Bhasin has also woven in so many interesting facts. He's in fact doing the job of a journalist, if you ask me, because he has all these some very racy bits of information about, fast-paced bits of information. There's that one part which I hadn't read elsewhere, so I'm grateful for the reference, where India decides. It's a very crucial moment in the India-Sri Lanka Accord, before the accord was signed, where India decides to send aid to the Tamils in Jaffna. I mean, there's obviously a huge shift going on and a lot of tussles internally for India, working with the Sri Lankan government, working for the Tamils, but also having some kind of a latent relationship with the LTT. And there's this one bit where the Sri Lankan High Commissioner is summoned to the MEA and for a 2 p.m. appointment. And in that 2 p.m. appointment, he is told that at 3 p.m. we will be, our jets are ready to take off to deliver aid to the Tamils in Jaffna. It's a violation of sovereignty. It was a major moment, of course. And he describes how that meeting actually goes on until 2:55. And the High Commissioner is essentially arguing with India about this about to happen imminent sort of breach of Sri Lankan sovereignty. Obviously, he didn't want to take such a difficult message back to his bosses in Colombo, and eventually it gets so late that he has to make the phone call to his foreign minister from the foreign secretary's office itself. So there are lots of little nuggets in this book which will keep you really engrossed in the conduct of diplomacy and how it works. He doesn't spare punches. He speaks about the role of the Tamils in that period as not being necessarily for the best. And by that I mean the Tamils who are in government in New Delhi. So he speaks about M.K. Narayanan, Chidambaram. Of course, the IPKF representative there in Colombo was External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, also from Tamil Nadu. So he does make it quite interesting without necessarily being diplomatic about it. I think it's important to remember that how these agreements came about is just as important as the agreements itself, because for a future generation of diplomats and journalists like me who cover this, it tells you how to negotiate with each of these countries, and you realize many of these characteristics last for a very, very long time. What he describes about the frustration of dealing with the Chinese is something that has happened again and again, and I think it's the subject of Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's book, Negotiating with the Chinese. The idea that you will finish the day having thought that you have come to a compromise, and then the next morning realize that actually the compromise was yours, but the Chinese position hasn't actually formally changed. That all that they were suggesting to you was if you did this, they would do this, but actually not keeping up their end, and then becoming extremely cryptic on the issue. And it's not just us who had to deal with it. If you read Kissinger's memoirs on China and others, you will see that even when the big Nixon Accord was to have been signed, and the US opened up its ties with China, and this was all being negotiated with Kissinger going through Pakistan, there are amazing bits where Kissinger goes at some considerable risk of being exposed. He goes to a dinner in Murree in Pakistan and is taken away from there by a secret Pakistani plane taken to Beijing. He has 2 days in which to meet both Mao and the premier. Yes, Zhou Enlai. And he does meet Zhou Enlai, but Mao keeps him waiting. And eventually, the time he has, most of the time is spent just sitting on a sofa and waiting for a meeting to happen, which is used as a kind of pressure point, so that by the time he gets to the meeting, he's just so grateful for getting the meeting that he agrees to more than they wanted. And actually, when the accord was signed, it was done in 2 bits. One bit when they were in Shanghai, and then they took a plane to Beijing. And in Shanghai, both sides had agreed to the contours of the agreement. I mean, I'm giving away a lot more, but you can read about it. And then when they get on the plane from Shanghai to Beijing, the officials come back and say, I'm sorry, we're not ready to sign unless you also put in the one China policy, unless you also put in so much more. So it's important for us to read this book with the idea of what we need to do with future negotiations as well. I think some of it may well be also listened to by our trade negotiators, who seem to be willing to now really speed up the process. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the idea that sometimes the best parts come if you are patient, if you're willing to say, if there is no deal, as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh once said, that is life, and move on from it, rather than necessarily expecting that if you give in just a little bit, that the deal will actually be better for both sides. So that's a crucial thing to learn as well. I was very interested by the details of the Shimla Agreement, for what messages were sent to the Soviets about what India wanted, and I think it's worth reading right now, because even today these are important. The idea that prisoners would be released, but that India insisted Bangladesh would be a part of it. That India would insist on the settlement of Kashmir as an integral and irreducible content of a settlement by Pakistan. That Pakistan needed to come to the line and say, we agree to a settlement on Kashmir. And in return, India was willing to give out a non-aggression treaty. This is all on page 110, if you have the book with you. And it really makes the point that if Pakistan were to give away in terms of a settlement with India on Kashmir, and it's a settlement. India was not necessarily saying it has to be all of Kashmir or this part of Kashmir or not. Pakistan would make more than enough up from the friendship that followed such an agreement. So certainly interesting, parts to this, which have a lot of substance and should be read by any real scholar or student of India's foreign policy history. I know that Mr. Bhasin has been critical of the way many of these agreements have been signed. But I think what emerges from a lot of what he was saying is that generally India has been driven not just by its own national interests, it has been driven by its national interests and seeking these agreements as a result of them, but those are not at the cost of interlocutors' interests. It makes India come across as a much more rational actor, if you ask me, and a much more humane actor in all of these negotiations than perhaps one might assume from just if you read the criticism. And, you know, in a sense, from 1946 onwards, India had this foreign policy attitude. Maybe some saw it as sanctimonious. But in general, it was the idea that India would be a voice that would speak up for the voiceless, that it would battle colonial and imperialist forces, and an aversion. I'm not saying non-alignment because that means different things. It certainly doesn't mean the non-aligned movement anymore. But an aversion to bloc politics, which I think is relevant even today, whether you consider the India-Soviet treaty as something that violated that or not. The truth is how India has behaved in the Russia-Ukraine war is in a sense true to those principles that Pandit Nehru actually announced to the Constituent Assembly in 1946, I think, and then repeated them in a radio show. If there is a request from me, I would certainly say that I hope Mr. Bhasin takes this work forward, that he looks at some of the other agreements as well that are obviously of importance, that Ambassador Shringla also referred to, and in particular, relationships that actually have worked, not just in terms of adhering to agreements, but in terms of updating them to modern times. And I'm speaking of the Bhutan agreement, which was updated in 2008 and made a big difference because Bhutan was embarking on a whole new world of democracy and constitution and all the rest of that. And the fact that we updated our agreement with Bhutan in a way that unfortunately we have not yet been able to do with Nepal, I think speaks to an important key to taking the relationship forward. So I'm going to stop over here. But thank you again for inviting me. And really thank you, Mr. Bhasin, for putting this together. It's an invaluable work for journalists, and I speak on behalf of so many of my colleagues.
Thank you, Suhasini. And your suggestion I should take up more agreement, I think it is a tall work you have said. At 90, for me to take up fresh agreements for discussion like that, I don't think it's going to be possible. Somebody else will have to do it.
Well, you should at least train an army of others who will take this work.
Nobody needs training. Everybody is trained if one wants to do it.
So thank you, Suhasini and Dr. Bhasin. I just wanted to comment on one part of what Suhasini said, which is not keeping up their end, which means to say that, there are many aspects of these agreements that are not always written. Of course, the point is that none of these agreements are set in stone, as we have seen. Even the most seminal agreements can be cast aside. But what happens to those parts of agreements that are informal in nature? You have an understanding. You spoke about the line of control being converted eventually into the international boundary, but never happened. The impression that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was an assurance that NATO will not expand eastwards, and this assurance was not put in writing. But none of that matters because what the Chinese have told us in 1957. Has no bearing, had no bearing in subsequent years. And what Bhutto told us in 1972 definitely did not work, from the moment that he uttered those words. There was absolutely no honor in that. But it's not just that. Personalities change, governments change, things move on. And so if you don't have anything in an agreement in writing, then, the sanctity of that is even less. So a lot of these things are based on informal understandings, agreements. Nehru thought this and Mrs. Gandhi thought that, but the fact is that none of this actually bears out because, things move on. But I don't know.
Sure. Sorry, I just butt in, but I think even Mr. Bhasin refers to it in one part of his book that even as close as after the 1971 war, the Soviet Union was not forthcoming with war replenishments for India. despite having signed this agreement. So you can't always make it out. But I don't think we should always see India as the kind of loser who's too trusting in all of this. We sign agreements at certain times because they are useful for us. I think the Soviet agreement was part of a much larger web of diplomacy by India ahead of the Bangladesh liberation war. So I think it was necessary to just get that done so that we had some bulwarks, and it does seem to have worked, because if you again read American archives, you realize that the US felt very thwarted, one by the Soviets agreement with India, but also then by the fact that because of this agreement, China was not keen to send a battalion, as Nixon had told Kissinger. Why can't you ask the Chinese just to scare the Indians a little bit by sending their tanks to the border? And the Chinese also perhaps were deterred because of the Soviet agreement. So I just want to make that point, that we're not necessarily the losers in all of this. The agreement itself comes because of what is before it. And yes, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't assume that anything that has not actually been written into the agreement will be adhered to at all, let alone when the agreement itself is not necessarily followed.
Sir, regarding these informal understandings which are not written down, it's important that we write in our own file. This was discussed and this was agreed to, but not written, so that after 20 years, 30 years, 5 years, any number of years, one knows what was done. So that Mrs. Gandhi Bhutto talk on the night of 2nd was not written anywhere, but she told Aksar at the end. And if we had written down, the Pakistani always show us any record you have got of those understanding.
No, that's very interesting. In those days, people still took very meticulous notes. Even the leaders might have noted down what they said.
That,
yeah.
Maybe there was so much to do next day, recording or various other things, it was too small a matter.
Today, taking notes means...
Himself has said in due course, the agreement will evolve and there will be... You see, since 1948, India has been requesting or pleading with Pakistan to accept the status quo. Where you are, you grab it. Whatever you have grabbed, you take it. In 1953, Muhammad Ali talks. Nehru, even in 1953, suggested regional, what you call, opinion, with 3 parts of Kashmir, Ladakh, Jammu, Kashmir should have 3 different separate, what you call, vote, and decided accordingly. Muhammad Ali heard it. He said he can't say anything. He will have to discuss with his cabinet. And after discussion with cabinet, he said sorry, because they knew if there's a vote, they will win. And therefore, they were not agreeable to anything. In 1960, when Nehru went to Pakistan to sign the Indus Water Treaty, he then also offered. But it is Pakistan which have been refusing. And this agreement was difficult for them to even settle on because people have been told that we have to take the whole of Kashmir.
I think also what Suhasini said about the fact that the Pakistanis have not thought through the suspension of the Simla agreement very carefully is what struck me as well. I think, it really, in some senses, provides really an opening, for a certain, change in status quo. Not that I'm saying that we should, but I'm saying that they have, in a sense, in a purely legal sense, provided that opening. But having said that, let's just say it's been a fascinating discussion. I think we really need, Charan Singh ji, need to do this, sort of on a panel basis, more interactive session where we can involve some of our other participants in this. But I do note that we have taken more time. It's supposed to be a 4 to 5 discussion. You did tell me that we should close at 5, but since it was so interesting, we've gone on and we've reached 5:20 point. But I would end by certainly echoing what Suhasini said, Dr. Bhasin, that you should think, of other publications in in a period post 2008. I think that's around the time that we've written on many of these relationships. One of the agreements that I think would merit your attention also is the India-Bangladesh Land Boundary Agreement. We also signed the Maritime Agreement at the same time, and I think this is the first comprehensive conclusion of a land and maritime boundary agreement that we have done with any neighbor. I think since we have worked out agreements
We have done
very
with
much
Pakistan
in past.
before that
Yeah,
in
that's what
1959.
a long time back. So from that perspective, it needs a little bit of introspection. We would encourage you to continue what you're doing, continue to to bring out more publications, and we will certainly look forward to those, Dr. Bhasin. So thank you so much. Thank you, Suhasini, for that excellent discussion. Thank you, Mr. Charan Singh, and all those who have organized this event, Vivek, and all the others. And of course, all the participants and those who have joined this conversation for really contributing by being a part of this very interesting discussion. And we look forward to many, many more. So let us, close the session for the time being. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much, sir. I am grateful to EGROW Foundation and Charan Singh ji for organizing it, and sir, for you to have taken the trouble of presiding over it. And Suhasini, you have really added a lot of juice to the whole discussion. And I thank all of you, and to all those who have joined us in the seminar. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'm happy that people have good words to say. Thank you once again.
Yeah, sir, Bhasin sir, before you leave, could you please, write down your number on the chat so that we can save your mobile number?
I must thank Ambassador Shringla for
My
chairing the
number is very
session
simple:
today.
9811 57294.
8 seconds, sir. Sir, you have got a good memory, not us.
Sir?
आपका तो अच्छा memory, sir. We can't remember like that. You tell, sir, please. Can you write down the chart? Can you type it on the chart, sir?
I will.
No, sir,
I will do it.
or you will repeat. Or you will repeat it, sir, again. 98.
Or repeat.
9811 57294.
So I must thank Ambassador Shringla for chairing the session today, and Avtar Singh Bhasin ji for delivering his talk, and Suhasini Haidar for the discussant note that she presented. I must say this doubtlessly has been a very interesting discussion, and very soon, in less than a month, we will have another webinar either on the Shimla Agreement or on the recent episode and India-Pakistan relations, because it can impact many things as it has unfolded in the last 48 hours. So probably we'll have to revisit the Shimla Agreement and the Indus Water Treaty and look at what's happening between the two neighbors and what implications it has for Viksit Bharat. So I must thank each one of the participants to make the discussion so interesting. I've seen the questions in the chat box, each one of them important, but because we ran out of time, the speaker couldn't answer some of these. But I think the addition of those questions themselves on the chat box have been very, very interesting, shows the interest as well as the issues that comes in the mind while listening to such intense discussions. Next week, we have a discussion on MSMEs, same time, 4 to 5 p.m. And I would welcome you all to join us in discussing about the MSMEs, because MSMEs is one such sector which I think will be important for the next 30 years to address the demographic dividend of our country. Another announcement that I wanted to make was this book by Mr. Avtar Singh Bhasin. This is the book. It's a fantastic book and a very light reading. It's about 400 pages and it is published by Penguin Viking. So if you are interested, this is the book we discussed today. With that, just want to share that today's discussion will be on our website by noon tomorrow. You're welcome to take advantage of that too, because it had lots of intense policy recommendations. As Suhasini summarized, should India keep waiting or should it be in a hurry? And I think I go with the analysis of Dr. Bhasin. I myself is from the army background, and the 71 war we were in Pathankot, and 72 agreement we thought was done in a great haste and hurry, and we should not have given up everything that we gave up. So there are many like me who feel that that agreement we lost a lot, all that we had gained. So with this, let me thank each one of you once again. Let me thank you, Mr. Bhasin, for being with us. We wish you lots of good research in years ahead. Thank you and see you next week.
Sir, thank you.